Have you ever witnessed two people who seemed destined to clash suddenly find themselves caught in a whirlwind of unexpected emotions? Imagine a towering, icy millionaire ruling over a grand estate, scrutinizing every detail with ruthless precision, while an unyielding maid quietly fights to maintain her self-respect. Tensions spark, misunderstandings swirl, and a single moment of vulnerability sets their worlds on a collision course. It's a story where pride and stubbornness stand in stark contrast to compassion and courage. Curious to discover how these fierce personalities end up unraveling the barriers in their hearts? Don't miss the chance to immerse yourself in this gripping journey from cold indifference to a surprisingly tender bond. Keep listening, because the path to their final revelation is paved with twists you won't see coming. Stick around until the very end. You might just find yourself rooting for two souls who never planned to care for each other. Aurelia Dumont pushed open the tall glass doors to the cross estate's sprawling kitchen, stepping into a space dominated by gleaming countertops and immaculate floors. Morning sunlight streamed in through floor-to-ceiling windows, highlighting the polished surfaces and the meticulous order that defined the room. As the clock neared 7, Aurelia's heart fluttered with a blend of determination and anxiety. Sebastian Cross, her employer, was due at any moment. Over the past 6 months, Aurelia had fallen into a strict routine, rising well before dawn to prepare freshly brewed coffee and select perfectly baked pastries. She moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, ensuring that each plate, fork, and spoon was positioned at precisely the right angle. Despite her care, a small tremor of nerves accompanied her every action this morning, the same tremor she felt whenever she anticipated Sebastian's arrival. Pausing near an expansive bay window, Aurelia allowed herself a moment to watch the first rays of sunlight dance across the manicured lawns. The estate's grandeur had both intrigued and intimidated her when she first arrived. In truth, she had never intended to stay in one place for too long. But here she was, half the year into what was supposed to be a temporary position, bound by necessity to maintain this job. Her younger brother, Caleb, was depending on her income for his education and medical needs. That reality weighed on Aurelia, serving as her constant reminder to endure the estate's sometimes suffocating atmosphere. She cast a final glance at the large dining table. Each setting was meticulously arranged. The cutlery gleamed under the morning light, and the napkins were folded into crisp shapes. The aroma of fresh croissant drifted from a nearby tray, complemented by the rich scent of coffee. This was a routine she had perfected, yet it never felt truly comfortable. Working under Sebastian Cross required meeting an almost impossible standard, a level of precision that left no room for mistakes. The staff warned newcomers that he was more than just a demanding boss. He was exacting to the point of obsession, with little tolerance for error. Just then, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, slicing the silence in half. Aurelia tensed, knowing it was Sebastian before she even saw him. He entered the kitchen, his presence imposing and austere. Dressed in a tailored suit, his dark hair neatly combed, Sebastian carried an air of authority that was as commanding as it was isolating. He nodded at Aurelia in acknowledgement, but said nothing, immediately turning his attention to the table. She stood aside, hands folded neatly in front of her, hoping there was nothing out of place. She feared any sign of displeasure on his part. His critical eye was legendary among the staff. He circled the table, running his fingertips along the edge of a napkin, examining a spoon's alignment. Aurelia felt as though she were on trial. The tension swelled until at last he paused, lifting his gaze to meet hers. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something more complicated than scorn in his eyes, perhaps the slightest hint of curiosity. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual mask of aloof indifference. Breaking the stillness, he said in a low voice, "The table is acceptable. Bring the coffee to my study in 10 minutes." Then he left as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving Aurelia to exhale the breath she'd been holding. Though the simple acknowledgement of her work might be seen as a small victory, Aurelia felt no sense of triumph. She stood in the sunlit kitchen, heart still pounding. In that brief exchange, she was reminded of Sebastian's icy demeanor, of how little she actually knew about the man whose moods dictated the household. Yet there was also a glimmer of relief. He hadn't found fault, this time at least. Gathering her composure, Aurelia began to arrange a fresh tray, mentally preparing for whatever challenges the day might bring. Sebastian Cross made his way through the corridor leading from the kitchen to his private study, each step echoing against the polished marble floors. There was a cool elegance to the estate, reflective of its owner's disposition. The walls were adorned with contemporary art pieces, chosen for their aesthetic impact rather than personal sentiment. Rarely did Sebastian decorate with anything that might betray an emotional attachment. For as long as most of the staff could remember, his approach to life was measured, meticulous, and profoundly isolated. He stepped into his study, a room that radiated both modern sophistication and a sense of fortress-like withdrawal. Behind a massive dark wood desk sat carefully arranged files and a state-of-the-art laptop, all tools of his high-level business dealings. Sebastian sank into his ergonomic chair, loosening his tie only slightly as he scanned his schedule for the day. There were meetings to attend, conference calls to host, and a seemingly endless barrage of emails to answer. The mechanical routine was something he not only accepted, but thrived upon. Distractions, especially those of a personal nature, had no place in Sebastian's world. Leaning back, he recalled the moment in the kitchen, Aurelia standing quietly watching him examine her work. He remembered her guarded expression and the faint trembling in her posture. A mere 6 months ago, Aurelia had arrived with careful politeness and quiet determination. She was unlike some former employees who either tried to curry favor or slinked around the estate in fear. Aurelia, in contrast, had an undercurrent of resolve that piqued his curiosity. Not that he'd openly admit it. Displaying any form of personal interest, even mild curiosity, felt too much like letting someone slip past his defenses. He was a man whose vulnerabilities had been tested before. A former business partner had nearly sunk his company through a betrayal that left Sebastian scrambling to rebuild what he had carefully constructed. Not long after, his fiancée ended their engagement with little more than a shrug, trading him for someone with an even greater promise of stability. These events shaped him into the man he was now, unyielding, skeptical, quick to judge, and slow to trust. While many thought of his frigid demeanor as simply part of his personality, Sebastian knew it was also a fortress around a wounded heart he refused to expose. A soft rap at the door interrupted his thoughts. Aurelia entered, balancing a tray with a mug of steaming coffee, a small pitcher of cream, and sugar cubes in a crystal bowl. She approached with careful steps, setting the tray down on the edge of the desk. "Your coffee, Mr. Cross," she said, her voice subdued but steady. Despite the slight bow of her head, he sensed a certain defiance in her posture, a refusal to be entirely cowed by his intensity. He glanced at the coffee. "Thank you," he replied curtly, eyes shifting from the tray to her. For a moment, neither spoke. He noted how she clasped her hands in front of her as if bracing for criticism. Then, rather than dismissing her abruptly, he cleared his throat and asked, "Any issues this morning?" Aurelia blinked as though taken aback that he would inquire at all. "No, sir. Everything seems in order," she answered, searching his face for any hidden agenda. After a brief pause, she added, "Let me know if you need anything else." The sentence was standard, but her tone carried a hint of genuine sincerity that lingered in the still air. Sebastian gave a curt nod, and she departed. Once alone, he settled back into his chair, staring at the coffee she'd prepared. The aroma was rich and inviting, a small detail he would ordinarily overlook. But this time, he found himself thinking about the care she'd put into such a minor task. Perhaps, he mused, Aurelia wasn't just another employee. There was a quiet resolve in her that both intrigued and unsettled him. Shaking his head, he forced his attention back to his laptop screen. Whatever curiosity Aurelia stirred, he had no intention of allowing it to disrupt the disciplined life he had so meticulously rebuilt. Outside his study, Aurelia walked away with her shoulders squared, her brow furrowed. She wasn't sure what to make of Sebastian's uncharacteristic question. Though it was barely more than a hint of conversation, it deviated from his customary aloofness. While she appreciated any small sign of civility, she reminded herself not to read too much into it. Her priority was to keep her job, save money, and help Caleb. That meant staying vigilant, performing her duties flawlessly, and not expecting compassion from the man who, to her, seemed as remote and polished as the estate itself. During the midday lull, Aurelia found herself in the staff quarters, a less opulent yet cozy space where the estate's employees could take a brief respite. She had finished setting out lunch in the dining room, leaving Sebastian to dine in silence. Now she sat at a small wooden table, reviewing a schedule for evening turn-down service. The hum of conversation from a few other staffers drifted around her, offering a momentary break from the tension that often occupied her day. Aurelia's thoughts inevitably turned to her brother Caleb. His face flashed in her mind, a teenager with a bright smile, big dreams, and a soul that remained hopeful despite their shared hardships. Thinking about him reminded her why she tolerated Sebastian's rigid demands. With no parents to support them, Aurelia had become Caleb's guardian at a young age, sacrificing her own opportunities for the sake of his future. She attended night classes sporadically, clinging to a vision of someday building a more stable life for them both. She glanced at her phone when hoping for a text or missed a call from Caleb. Nothing yet. A small pang of worry tugged at her. He had mentioned not feeling well recently. The stress of balancing part-time jobs, schoolwork, and the cost of living weighed heavily on Aurelia's mind. Still, she pressed on, telling herself that once she finished her studies, she might find a better position, something that would pay enough to give Caleb the life he deserved. Yet the thought of leaving the Cross estate wasn't that simple. The salary, though modest relative to Sebastian's immense wealth, was still significantly higher than what she could find elsewhere. It was an unfortunate truth. Sebastian Cross's unyielding standards guaranteed only top-tier employees stayed, and they were compensated accordingly. Shortly after, the senior housekeeper, Mrs. Hopkins, approached Aurelia. With soft gray hair pinned in a neat bun, the older woman carried herself with a blend of grace and confidence that came from years of managing staff for demanding employers. "Aurelia, dear," she said quietly, "could you help me inventory the cleaning supplies this afternoon? We have a new shipment, and I want to make sure everything is accounted for." Aurelia nodded, rising to her feet. "Of course, Mrs. Hopkins. Just let me finish updating the turn-down list." She closed her planner and followed the housekeeper down the corridor toward a large storage closet where shelves were lined with neatly labeled bottles and boxes. The distinct scent of cleaning chemicals tinged the air as they entered. "Careful with that top shelf," Mrs. Hopkins cautioned, handing Aurelia a clipboard. "I suspect there might be duplicates of some supplies, and we don't want to reorder unnecessarily." Aurelia climbed a small step stool, scanning labels and noting quantities. Meanwhile, Mrs. Hopkins hovered by the doorway, occasionally directing her to check a particular corner or to mark a specific product. After a few minutes of companionable silence, the older woman spoke again, her voice tinged with concern. "You've done well here, Aurelia. Lasting 6 months under Mr. Cross's expectations is no small feat." A fleeting smile touched Aurelia's lips. "I appreciate the vote of confidence. Some days I feel like I'm just hanging on." She paused, carefully lifting a heavy box of sponges. "He can be difficult, but I need this job." Mrs. Hopkins nodded sympathetically. "I understand. He wasn't always so cold, you know. People say he's been betrayed once too often. While that doesn't excuse harsh treatment, it might explain it." She sighed, briefly studying Aurelia. "Still, you should protect yourself, dear. Don't let his aloofness diminish your own warmth." Aurelia's eyes lingered on the rows of bottles, but her thoughts turned inward. Despite Sebastian's frosty demeanor, she had caught rare glimpses of what might lie beneath. She wasn't sure if it was empathy or just her own wishful thinking, but sometimes she wondered whether a part of him yearned for genuine connection. "I'll be careful," she murmured, returning to her task. They worked in silence for a while, the repetitive nature of counting supplies strangely soothing. The only interruptions were the faint echoes of staff members moving through the corridor. Aurelia used the time to steady her emotions. The day wasn't even half over, and she suspected Sebastian's exacting standards would test her patience again before nightfall. Finishing the inventory, she offered Mrs. Hopkins the clipboard. The older woman gave her a grateful nod. "Good work, Aurelia. Thank you." Then, lowering her voice, she added, "And if things get too heavy, remember you can always confide in me. I've seen staff come and go like a revolving door here. But you have a calm strength about you. Don't let anyone take that away." Aurelia felt an unexpected surge of gratitude. She met Mrs. Hopkins's kind gaze, a mix of humility and relief blooming within her. "I appreciate that more than you know." With renewed resolve, she headed back to the main hallway, passing through the estate's elegant spaces once more, preparing herself for whatever challenges the remainder of the day would bring. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marbled floors as Aurelia wheeled a cart of fresh linens into one of the upstairs corridors. These hallways, reserved for private rooms and luxurious guest suites, exuded an aura of hushed opulence. Oil paintings and gilded frames lined the walls, each piece curated to match Sebastian Cross's refined yet impersonal taste. Up here, traffic was minimal. Most days, Aurelia could complete her tasks without encountering anyone aside from a passing security staff member or perhaps the estate manager. Today, however, she was startled to find Sebastian himself striding through the corridor, engaged in a tense phone call. His voice, typically controlled, carried a razor's edge of frustration. As he spotted Aurelia, he cut the conversation short with a brisk, "We'll discuss this later," and ended the call. For a moment, she wondered if he was going to reprimand her simply for overhearing, but his expression suggested a different kind of tension, one unrelated to her. Not wanting to intrude, Aurelia kept her gaze down, focusing on the crisp, folded sheets in her cart. But Sebastian approached, halting just a few steps away. "Is everything going smoothly with the guest rooms?" he asked, his tone more measured than usual. She paused, meeting his eyes. "Yes, Mr. Cross. I'm replacing linens and ensuring each suite is ready in case you have visitors." She spoke matter-of-factly, carefully avoiding the abrupt curiosity that burned at the back of her mind. How often did he truly have guests? From what she'd observed, he rarely invited anyone to stay, aside from the occasional business associate or friend like Donovan Pierce, though she had yet to meet Donovan herself. Sebastian nodded, his posture relaxing marginally. "Good," he said. Then, seeming to remember the phone call, he glanced at his screen with a frown before turning back to her. "There's a gathering next week, some potential business partners flying in. Make sure the suites on this floor are in perfect order." "Yes, sir," Aurelia responded, making a mental note to double-check everything from the linens to the toiletries. A small part of her felt a jolt of worry. With important guests, Sebastian's standards would only intensify. But she remained calm on the surface. After all, she had weathered his demands this long. What was another high-pressure event? Just as she was about to move on, Sebastian did something that caught her off guard. He lingered. His gaze traveled across her cart, taking in the neatly folded towels and fresh sheets. For an awkward second, he looked as though he wanted to say more. Aurelia resisted the urge to fill the silence, waiting to see if he would break it first. Finally, he spoke, his voice lower. "You've been here 6 months now, correct?" She nodded, unsure where the conversation was heading. "I imagine you know the house routines well by this point." She wondered if he was fishing for a complaint or if he intended to shuffle her duties around. "I do my best, sir," Aurelia replied, careful to remain neutral. He nodded slowly. "That's clear," he murmured, then cleared his throat as if embarrassed by his own remark. "Carry on," he said more briskly, turning away. Within moments, he was down the corridor, phone in hand, rejoining whatever business crisis he had put on hold. Aurelia stood there for a moment, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. Had Sebastian just acknowledged her effort, albeit indirectly? He hadn't criticized the linens or scolded her posture or pointed out a missed speck of dust. Instead, he'd shown a rare moment of hesitation, as though uncertain how to proceed when not issuing a direct order. It was a minor event, perhaps even inconsequential in the grand scheme of the Cross estate. Yet for Aurelia, it felt like a subtle shift, one that hinted there might be more to Sebastian than his frigid exterior. Pushing the cart forward, she tried to dismiss the flicker of curiosity that lingered. She reminded herself that Sebastian Cross was her employer, not a friend or confidant. Forming any kind of personal connection with him could complicate her already delicate situation. Still, as she continued down the corridor, a small voice inside her whispered that perhaps she wasn't alone in feeling that subtle change in the air, a change that left her both intrigued and uneasy in equal measure. As evening wrapped the estate in soft shadows, Aurelia found herself in the formal dining room, placing candles at measured intervals along the polished mahogany table. She checked the alignment of silverware once again, pressing out any lingering creases in the linen napkins. Everything in the Cross estate adhered to a certain ritual, an unspoken code of refinement that demanded vigilance. While Aurelia had grown accustomed to this unyielding standard, She still felt a prick of anxiety whenever Sebastian neared. She recalled the small exchange in the upstairs corridor and couldn't shake the feeling that something about him had shifted. He seemed preoccupied, agitated even, when he found her replacing linens, only to soften slightly by the end of their brief conversation. Could it be the strain of an upcoming business deal or something more personal? Aurelia knew better than to pry. Nevertheless, the question circled in her mind, refusing to settle. Her reflections were interrupted when she noticed a tall figure standing in the dining room entrance. Sebastian Cross, hands in his suit pockets. She tensed, bracing herself for scrutiny over the table settings. Instead, he merely observed her for a few seconds before speaking. "I'll be dining alone this evening. No need for an elaborate spread. A simple meal will suffice," he said. Aurelia gave a curt nod. "Understood, Mr. Cross. Shall I prepare your usual?" Usually simple in Sebastian's world meant gourmet salmon, or perhaps a perfectly grilled steak, with sides carefully selected by the estate's chef. "Yes," he replied, though his voice lacked its typical crispness. He crossed into the room, resting a hand on the back of a chair. Aurelia felt her nerves tighten, waiting for a comment about the placement of napkins or the angle of the water glasses. But he said nothing of the sort. Instead, he exhaled, as though grappling with a thought. "I've noticed you've been consistent," he began, his gaze traveling over the meticulously set table. "From what Mrs. Hopkins tells me, you rarely make mistakes." She paused, not entirely sure how to respond. "I do my best to meet your standards, sir," she managed, meeting his eyes briefly before dropping her gaze. A faint furrow creased his brow. "That's all," he stated, turning away with a dismissive nod. The conversation ended as abruptly as it started, leaving Aurelia momentarily puzzled. It was oddly intimate for Sebastian. Praise, however muted, wasn't something he freely offered. As she watched him depart, a swirl of conflicting emotions took hold. On one hand, she felt a ripple of warmth at the indirect compliment. On the other, she questioned whether it was truly kindness or just another facet of Sebastian's aloof control. She tried to put it out of her mind, focusing on her duties. There was dinner to oversee, dishes to clear, and a final round of tidying before she could retire to her cramped quarters. A few hours later, she stood in the kitchen with the evening staff, verifying that every pot and utensil was returned to its rightful place. The flicker of overhead fluorescent lights matched her own fatigue. Still, her mind lingered on that brief exchange. It felt as though she and Sebastian were dancing around the edges of unfamiliar territory, each uncertain how to proceed. Eventually, the staff clocked out, leaving Aurelia to complete a last sweep of the dining room. She dimmed the lights, checked the locked windows, and walked through the silent corridors. In the hush, she couldn't help but remember Mrs. Hopkins' words about not losing her warmth. Yet the more she witnessed Sebastian's enigmatic behavior, moments of distant scrutiny interrupted by fleeting gestures of acknowledgement, the more she wondered if he was battling his own ghosts, uncertain of how to treat someone who didn't recoil under his chilly demeanor. Finally, she arrived at her room in the staff quarters, a modest space with a narrow bed and a small desk. She shrugged off her uniform jacket and sank onto the mattress, exhaustion weighing on her limbs. Tomorrow would bring another day of meeting Sebastian's formidable expectations. However, for the first time in a long while, she felt a faint spark of curiosity, maybe even hope, about what lay hidden behind the rigid walls he kept around his life. She pushed the thought aside. Duty came first, and hope could be a dangerous luxury in a place like the Cross Estate. Aurelia was jolted awake by the buzz of her phone early the next morning. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw Caleb's name flashing on the screen. It was unusual for him to call at this hour. Sitting up quickly, she answered, her voice hushed. "Caleb, is everything all right?" His tone crackled with fatigue. "I'm okay, Aurelia, just having these headaches. The doctor wants me to come in for a few tests, but I'm short on the copay." There was a slight tremor in his voice, an attempt to sound casual despite the seriousness of his situation. A pang shot through her. She knew he hated asking for money, just as she hated being unable to offer more. "How much are you short?" she asked, her hand already reaching for the small notepad by her bed. "About $150, he replied reluctantly. "I'll figure something out if you can't manage it. Maybe a weekend gig or something. Don't stress yourself." Aurelia swallowed hard. She had rent due in a week, and her own tuition bills lingered like a threat on the horizon. But Caleb's health came first. "Don't worry, I'll get you what you need. Go see the doctor. Please." She forced her voice to remain calm and reassuring, though anxiety churned in her gut. After ending the call, Aurelia stared at the phone for a moment, her mind swirling with potential solutions. Perhaps she could ask for an advance. The very thought of requesting it from Sebastian was daunting, but she was running out of options. She dressed hurriedly, mentally rehearsing how she might broach the topic. Yet, as she made her way through the corridors toward the kitchen, the fortress-like atmosphere of the Cross estate reminded her just how unapproachable Sebastian could be. Even if she managed to catch him in a lenient mood, there was no guarantee he'd grant her request. Once in the kitchen, she started prepping breakfast, a delicate routine involving fresh fruit arrangements, hand-ground coffee, and artfully presented pastries. The task helped distract her from her worries. She was carefully slicing strawberries when Sebastian entered. Scanning the space, spotting her, he approached. His gaze took in the fruit, the immaculate counters, and finally settled on Aurelia's tense expression. "Everything in order for breakfast?" he asked. The question, standard as it was, felt loaded this morning, as though he noticed something off in her demeanor. "Yes, Mr. Cross," Aurelia replied, forcing a small smile. Her hands shook slightly as she continued slicing. She contemplated her plan to ask for an advance and felt her stomach knot. Before she could muster the courage, he excused himself, mentioning some urgent call. He left a swirl of cologne in his wake, and Aurelia let out a slow breath. Perhaps it was for the best. Her request might come off as unprofessional in such a rushed moment. She decided she'd wait for a more opportune time, maybe after lunch, when Sebastian was usually less preoccupied. For the rest of the morning, she tried to focus on her tasks, but her thoughts kept drifting to Caleb and the looming medical expense. Staffers bustled around her with their own chores, oblivious to her internal struggle. She considered confiding in Mrs. Hopkins, but the idea of exposing her financial desperation felt too risky. Despite the quiet kindness she had encountered, Aurelia found it hard to trust anyone within these walls. She recalled how quickly staff could be replaced if Sebastian lost confidence in them. Eventually, midday arrived, and Aurelia found herself ferrying a lunch tray to Sebastian's study. She knocked and entered upon his command, balancing the tray with as much composure as she could gather. He barely glanced up from his desk, preoccupied with spreadsheets on his laptop. Setting the tray down, she noticed the lines of tension on his brow, a sign of stress she'd become adept at reading. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, her courage faltered. The question stuck in her throat. He made no move to inquire about her or invite conversation, so she simply bowed her head and left. A sense of defeat clung to her as she exited, knowing Caleb was counting on her. The day marched on, and while she managed to keep up appearances, inside she felt as though she were drowning, each moment drawing her closer to a decision she dreaded. By late afternoon, Aurelia felt the weight of her dilemma pressing ever more urgently. Between her duties, she ducked into a quiet corner of the staff wing, checking her phone in hopes of a text from Caleb with better news. Nothing. Anxiety twisted her stomach, stirring thoughts of her mother's final days in a hospital she and Caleb had long struggled to forget. She couldn't bear the possibility that her brother might face any serious condition without proper care. With a shaky resolve, she decided she couldn't keep stalling. She remembered that Sebastian occasionally reviewed household budgets around 4 in the afternoon. Perhaps she could time her request for an advance then, framing it as an urgent personal matter. Gripping her notepad, she forced herself to walk down the corridor leading to his office. Each step was a battle against a racing heart and the fear of rejection. Reaching the study door, she was about to knock when a familiar, resonant voice echoed from inside. She paused, recognizing the voice as Donovan Pierce, one of Sebastian's old friends and business associates, or so rumor had it. The staff rarely saw Donovan, but stories of his arrogance and sharp tongue were well known. Aurelia's hand froze mid-knock, her anxiety intensifying. She had hoped to speak with Sebastian privately, but if Donovan was there, it complicated everything. "Donovan, I have things under control." Sebastian's voice drifted through the door, laced with mild irritation. "You don't need to micromanage this deal." Aurelia hesitated, uncertain if she should interrupt. The men seemed engaged in a pointed conversation, their tones suggesting tension. Donovan responded in a low, mocking drawl that Aurelia couldn't fully discern, but the tone alone suggested friction. Deciding to retreat, Aurelia stepped back from the door, her pulse hammering. She'd have to wait until Donovan left, or else risk intruding on a sensitive discussion. As she turned to leave, she heard a snippet of Donovan's sneering remark. "Like that little maid of yours?" The mention sent a jolt of discomfort through Aurelia, a stark reminder that her place in this household was precarious at best. Though she desperately needed the advance, barging in now was a risk she wasn't prepared to take. She headed down to the kitchen, each step a swirl of conflicting emotions: fear, frustration, and a sense of powerlessness. The aroma of dinner preparations did little to soothe her nerves. Beatrice, a new maid who had only recently started, greeted Aurelia with a bright smile. "Need help with anything?" she asked, apparently unaware of the storm brewing in Aurelia's mind. Aurelia forced a polite nod, handing Beatrice a small list of tasks. "If you could check the silverware for tonight's dinner, I'd appreciate it." Her voice sounded hollow to her own ears. As Beatrice left, Aurelia leaned against the counter, staring at her reflection in a polished copper pot. She looked exhausted, shadows under her eyes betraying sleepless nights. She thought of Caleb once more, and the awkward request she still hadn't managed to voice. Time ticked on, the dinner hour looming. She heard Donovan's laughter echo from somewhere in the house and cringed. The last thing she wanted was to face that man on top of everything else. She grabbed a cloth to wipe down the counters, trying to steady her thoughts through mindless cleaning. Before she could decide her next move, Mrs. Hopkins entered, eyeing Aurelia's tense posture. "You all right, my dear?" the older woman asked gently. Aurelia offered a faint smile but didn't elaborate. She couldn't bring herself to spill her troubles, particularly not when Donovan's presence threatened an unpredictable confrontation. As she continued cleaning, Aurelia whispered a silent prayer for strength. She knew that time was running out. Caleb couldn't wait much longer. Yet the Cross Estate's power dynamics felt insurmountable. Sebastian was in a meeting with a friend rumored to be as formidable as he was, and Aurelia's courage was waning. The day's events seemed to conspire against her, each moment eroding the fragile hope she clung to. For now, all she could do was brace herself for whatever came next, though she feared that the next few hours might tilt her carefully balanced world in an irreversible way. When evening finally arrived, the Cross Estate wore its usual cloak of refined splendor. Soft lights illuminated the sprawling gardens, while crystal chandeliers cast an elegant glow across the dining room. Aurelia moved with practiced grace, ensuring that every detail met Sebastian's exacting criteria. Still, an undercurrent of dread simmered within her, fed by Donovan's continued presence. She soon discovered that Donovan would be dining with Sebastian. The chef, informed at the last minute, rushed to finalize a sophisticated menu. Aurelia set about laying out immaculate place settings, folding napkins into perfect shapes, and checking that each wineglass sparkled without a single smudge. Meanwhile, she overheard snatches of conversation between Sebastian and Donovan drifting from the adjoining sitting room. Their voices carried a tension that seemed to escalate with each passing sentence. "Donovan's the worst kind of guest," one of the footmen muttered to Aurelia in passing, rolling his eyes. "Last time he came, he demanded we serve him a new bottle of wine because the first glass had lost its ideal temperature. Then he didn't even drink it." Aurelia sighed, her apprehension deepening. She had planned on speaking with Sebastian tonight, somehow, some way, about Caleb's urgent need for funds. But the prospect of interrupting a meal shared with Donovan Pierce made her blood run cold. She recalled the rumor she'd overheard earlier, Donovan's mocking tone referencing "that little maid." The idea of dealing with his overt arrogance in front of Sebastian was almost more daunting than Sebastian's own harsh manner. Still, she had to at least try. Her brother's well-being outweighed her pride or even her fear. As she placed the final salad fork at the correct angle, she steeled herself. Perhaps she could catch Sebastian after dinner, once Donovan had retired for the evening or left the estate entirely. She rehearsed a calm, factual plea in her mind, hoping that Sebastian's recent mild softening would work in her favor. When the two men entered the dining room, Aurelia instinctively lowered her eyes, maintaining the stance of a dutiful servant. Sebastian's gaze flicked over her for a fleeting second, betraying no emotion. Donovan, however, paused, taking her in with a slow, appraising look that made her skin crawl. He offered a smirk that reeked of condescension. "Ah, so this is the dedicated help you've been telling me about," he drawled, directing his remark at Sebastian but pointedly staring at Aurelia. Sebastian's jaw tightened. "This is Aurelia, yes. She manages the household details." His response was clipped, and Aurelia sensed that it was his way of cautioning Donovan not to stir up trouble. The meal began in strained silence, broken occasionally by Donovan's attempts at conversation about business deals Aurelia barely understood. She hovered near the wall, ready to serve and clear plates as needed. Each time she approached the table, Donovan's gaze felt invasive, pricking her nerves. Sebastian, for his part, seemed more guarded than ever, answering Donovan in curt monosyllables when the conversation veered too personal. As Donovan drained his second glass of wine, his attention turned once more to Aurelia. "You've done quite a fine job with dinner," he said, the words themselves polite, though his tone dripped with sarcasm. Aurelia forced a nod of gratitude, her spine rigid. She might have exited the room right then, if not for the duty to clear the plates. Instead, she stepped forward to collect their finished appetizers. "Thank you, sir," she managed, voice subdued but polite. Sebastian watched her with an expression she couldn't decipher, as though deciding whether to intervene. Donovan, however, took the opportunity to continue speaking. "I suppose it takes a certain kind of resilience to work here under Sebastian's eagle-eyed scrutiny," Donovan mused, swirling the wine in his glass. "You must be quite used to his demands." Aurelia swallowed hard, choosing silence over engagement, yet she could feel the tension radiating from Sebastian. "It's a living," she finally said, forcing the words out. Donovan chuckled, the sound low and derisive. Sebastian's gaze darkened, flicking between Aurelia and his so-called friend. She half expected him to reprimand Donovan, but he remained silent. In that pause, she realized anew the precarious position she occupied, caught between a wealthy man's cold detachment and his arrogant guest's demeaning curiosity. The rest of the dinner progressed similarly, a disconcerting interplay of barbed remarks from Donovan and Sebastian's stony retorts. Aurelia continued her duties, each moment twisting her hopes for a private conversation into knots. By the time the plates were cleared and dessert was served, she felt utterly exhausted, physically from her work and emotionally from the tension swirling in the room. Retreating to the kitchen, she leaned against a countertop, heart pounding. Beatrice caught her eye, concern evident in the younger maid's expression. Aurelia shook her head, silently signaling she was all right. For now. She drew in a steadying breath, bracing for one final round of service before the meal concluded and Donovan took his leave. Whether she'd managed to speak to Sebastian afterward remained uncertain, overshadowed by the unpleasant reality that tonight's dinner had set an even frostier stage than before. After Donovan finally left later that night, the relief among the household staff was palpable. Footmen quietly collected empty wine bottles, and the chef supervised the cleanup with evident satisfaction that the troublesome guest had departed. Aurelia wiped down the last of the counters, hoping her moment might come to speak with Sebastian now that he was alone. Yet a part of her recoiled at the memory of Donovan's leering gaze and his not-so-subtle jabs. Her confidence was rattled, and she questioned whether this was truly the right time. Before she could decide, Mrs. Hopkins appeared by her side. "You've had a rough evening, child. Why don't you go rest? I'll see to the last few tasks." The older woman's voice was gentle, but her eyes held genuine concern. Aurelia wanted to protest. She needed this chance to talk to Sebastian, but she felt so drained that she could only nod in gratitude. With heavy steps, she retreated to her room. Slipping inside, Aurelia set her phone on the small desk and let out a long breath. Even if she did find Sebastian, would he be in any mood to grant an advance after Donovan's visit? The man had a way of stirring up negativity and leaving it in his wake. Aurelia peeled off her uniform, opting for comfortable sweats as she tried to clear her mind. A glance at her phone revealed a missed call from Caleb. Her heart lurched. She quickly dialed back, drumming her fingers anxiously while it rang. He picked up on the third ring. "Sis, it's late. Everything okay?" His voice sounded a touch stronger than before, which was a small comfort. She sighed. "I'm all right. Just got done with a difficult dinner service." She hesitated, deciding against burdening him with the details. I'm working on getting you that money. Don't worry. A brief silence passed before Caleb replied, I know you always come through, Aurelia, but hey, if it's too much, I can delay a bit. The doctor said it's not an emergency, just precautionary. Her throat tightened. Precautionary or not, I don't want to risk it, she said, pushing aside her own exhaustion. I'll figure it out. Promise. After reassuring him a while longer, she ended the call, lying back on her bed with an arm draped over her eyes. A wave of hopelessness washed over her. Despite her best intentions, the day had slipped on without providing a single opportunity to address her financial crisis. For a few minutes, she pondered the possibility of a payday loan, but the interest rates would be crushing. Another idea surfaced, selling a few valuables, although she owned almost nothing of real worth. She recalled the sparkly bracelet from her late mother, an heirloom of sentimental value, but perhaps not enough to cover the medical bills. The thought of parting with it gnawed at her. At last, she decided her best recourse was still Sebastian. He might be cold, but he wasn't irrational. He valued efficiency and results, and Aurelia had proven she could deliver both. If she approached him calmly, explaining her urgent need, maybe he'd consider a small advance or even a loan. It was a slender thread of hope, but she clung to it nonetheless. Rolling onto her side, Aurelia gazed at her reflection in the small mirror across the room. Shadows under her eyes, tension in her brow, signs of a stress she had grown all too accustomed to. As much as she disliked the vulnerability of asking for help, especially from a man like Sebastian, her brother's health mattered more than her pride. She resolved to approach him first thing in the morning, before the daily chaos could distract him further. Yet, as she closed her eyes, Donovan's sneering face intruded on her thoughts, followed by the memory of Sebastian's guarded silence at dinner. Doubts and fears wove themselves into her mind like a dark tapestry. She couldn't help but wonder if she had already lost any goodwill Sebastian might have had to spare. Drifting into a troubled sleep, Aurelia held tight to the fragile belief that some small measure of mercy might still lie beneath Sebastian Cross's formidable exterior. Aurelia left Sebastian's office clutching the check like a precious talisman, her thoughts swirling with relief and lingering surprise. She slipped into her small room in the staff quarters and immediately dialed Caleb. The phone rang several times before he answered, his voice still tinged with fatigue, but carrying a note of hope. Hey, sis, he greeted, trying to sound upbeat. Any news? She smiled despite the tension that lingered in her body. Yes, I have what you need. I can wire you the money as soon as I'm off, and you can get those tests done right away. Silence met her announcement, then a soft exhale that told her Caleb had been more worried than he let on. Aurelia, thank you. You always pull through, he said, his voice wavering slightly. Hearing her brother's gratitude buoyed her spirits. For the first time in days, she felt a small measure of calm. After confirming the details for his doctor's appointment, Aurelia ended the call and sank onto the edge of her bed. Her thoughts inevitably returned to Sebastian. She couldn't reconcile how easily he'd granted her request with the man who once critiqued the angle of a fork or the shape of her napkin folds. Yet, she wasn't naive enough to believe this one act of kindness signaled a permanent shift in his demeanor. A single wave does not change the tide, she reminded herself, but she allowed a flicker of gratitude to linger. Determined to return to her duties with renewed focus, Aurelia emerged from her room and headed toward the kitchen to help with the midday tasks. Along the way, she passed Donovan Pierce, who was unexpectedly roaming the estate. The sight of him made her heart lurch. She had hoped his visit was over, but evidently he was staying on for a bit longer, perhaps conducting business with Sebastian. He caught her eye and paused, an unsettling smile creeping across his face. Well, hello again, he drawled, his gaze roving over her as though she were a curiosity. Busy as ever, I see. If only Sebastian could understand the finer points of giving his staff time to breathe. His tone suggested mock concern, but Aurelia detected the patronizing lilt that always accompanied his words. She dipped her head politely, refusing to engage. Excuse me, sir, I have tasks to complete. Attempting to move past him, she found her path blocked by his subtle shift to the left. Let's not be rude, Donovan chided, raising one eyebrow. I only wanted to inquire how you managed to survive in this house. Sebastian's a demanding man, isn't he? The question glimmered with implication. Aurelia felt a chill at the unspoken insinuations swirling in his mind. Mr. Cross is fair in his own way, she said curtly, stepping around Donovan more assertively this time. She refused to be cornered like prey. Now, if you'll excuse me. She made her retreat, her cheeks burning from a mix of anger and unease. Donovan's presence cast a long shadow over the estate, reminding her of just how precarious her position could be. She arrived in the kitchen with her composure mostly intact, though her heart pounded from the brief confrontation. Mrs. Hopkins was there, kneading dough for fresh bread. She glanced up, noting Aurelia's unsettled expression. "You all right, dear?" she asked, voice sought with concern. Aurelia gave a stiff nod, resolving not to trouble the older woman with details. "Just tension in the house. I'll manage," she murmured. Mrs. Hopkins nodded knowingly and didn't press further. Grateful for the opportunity to lose herself in work, Aurelia spent the next hour chopping vegetables, stirring simmering sauces, and double-checking place settings for lunch. Her mind, however, never strayed far from Donovan's intrusive smirk or the memory of Sebastian calmly handing her the check that morning. Two men, so different in their methods, yet both held power in her life. One by intimidation, the other by the complex interplay of authority and unexpected generosity. As Aurelia garnished a plate of grilled chicken, she steeled herself with a silent promise. No matter how complicated things became, she would see Caleb through his tests and maintain her dignity. Donovan's arrogance and Sebastian's unpredictability would not derail her. She'd made it this far, and though the path ahead remained uncertain, she felt a stirring of resilience. This place, with all its undercurrents of wealth and influence, would not break her. The next morning broke with a pale sky, hinting at a day that might be calmer, or so Aurelia hoped. She rose earlier than usual, dressing swiftly and making her way toward Sebastian's office. It was a gamble. Sometimes he held meetings off-site, and other times he buried himself in conference calls from daybreak. But she had to try. Her footsteps sounded unnaturally loud in the estate's stillness. When she reached his office, she found the door slightly ajar. She peered in, spotting Sebastian at his desk, rifling through a stack of documents. For a moment she stood there, summoning courage. Then she rapped softly on the doorframe. His head lifted, brows knitting until he recognized her. "Aurelia," he acknowledged, setting aside his paperwork. Though his tone was brisk, he didn't dismiss her outright. "Is there an issue with the household?" She took a breath. "Not exactly, sir. I was hoping I could speak with you, briefly, about a personal matter." Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. She stepped inside, leaving the door ajar to maintain some semblance of formality. Sebastian motioned for her to continue. His expression remained impassive, but Aurelia caught the faintest flicker of curiosity in his eyes. Placing her hands together, she tried not to fidget. "I have an unexpected expense," she began carefully, fighting the urge to launch into a nervous ramble. "My brother needs to undergo medical tests, and the cost is more than I can afford right now. I was wondering if I might receive an advance on my salary, just this once." The words hung between them in an uneasy silence. Sebastian studied her, his gaze cool, assessing. "How much do you need?" he asked finally, leaning back in his chair. The question came without any evident judgment, but Aurelia sensed a tension beneath his calm exterior. $150, she replied quietly. "I can repay it gradually, miss, of course. Or if it's easier, you can deduct it from my future pay. Her voice caught, and she forced a swallow. "I just want to make sure my brother gets the tests he needs. It's important." Sebastian's fingers tapped once on the desk. "I see," he said, tone unreadable. Another pause stretched out, and Aurelia's heart hammered in her chest. "You've been here for 6 months, and you've done your job reliably. I have no reason to doubt your work ethic." She couldn't quite tell if this was a segue into acceptance or a dismissal. After a moment that felt agonizingly long, Sebastian drew out his checkbook. "Very well," he said, flipping to a blank check. "But consider it an advance, not a gift. The amount will be deducted from your next paycheck and the one after, if needed." Aurelia's relief was almost dizzying. She let out a shaky breath. "Of course, sir. Thank you. I appreciate this more than I can say." He scribbled on the check, then tore it off, handing it to her. She reached out, fingers trembling slightly, and accepted the slip of paper as though it were a lifeline. "Make sure your brother receives the care he requires," Sebastian said quietly. I expect you back to work with full focus. Yes, Mr. Cross, she said, her voice faltering with gratitude. I'll be back on track immediately. Thank you again. Feeling the warmth of tears threatening to surface, she dipped her head in a respectful bow and turned to leave before her emotions betrayed her. As she exited, her mind buzzed with a mix of relief and disbelief. She clutched the check carefully, already planning how to deposit it, how to schedule Caleb's appointment that very day. Yet, in the recesses of her heart, she couldn't ignore a subtle sense of surprise at how easily Sebastian had agreed. The man who demanded perfection in the angle of a spoon had, with minimal debate, granted a personal favor that might save her brother from worsening health problems. Shutting the office door behind her, Aurelia walked away in a daze. The estate's grand corridors seemed less foreboding for once. She felt the urge to smile, though she quickly tempered it. She owed Sebastian a debt, financially and perhaps in gratitude, but she also sensed there was more to him than the aloof figure he presented. For the first time, she entertained a glimmer of possibility that beneath his stony facade lay a capacity for empathy, one that might surface again if given the right circumstance. Still, she reminded herself not to jump to conclusions. As she hurried toward her room to call Caleb, check in hand, she knew better than most how fleeting kindness could be in a place like the Cross Estate. Yet for now, her anxiety over Caleb's care was eased, and that alone was a victory she clung to as she rounded the corner and disappeared down the hall. By late afternoon, Sebastian summoned Aurelia to assist with organizing boxes of paperwork and folders in his study, records he kept on the estate's finances, staff payroll, and upcoming projects. Though Aurelia was accustomed to the nuances of household management, venturing into Sebastian's personal administrative realm felt like a step into more intimate territory. She approached the door with a sense of caution, unsure of what version of Sebastian she'd encounter. "Come in," his voice called after her soft knock. She entered, finding him seated at his large desk, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He gestured towards several cardboard boxes stacked near a cabinet. "I need a more efficient filing system. I assume your organizational skills might be useful here." Aurelia forced a polite smile. "I'll do my best, Mr. Cross. Which files would you like me to start with?" He rose from his chair, pulling out a sheaf of documents and handing them over. Their fingers briefly brushed in the exchange, an incidental contact that made Aurelia's pulse hitch. She glanced up, noticing the slightest hesitation in his expression, as though he too registered that fleeting moment of contact. But if he felt anything, he hid it well beneath a guarded nod. They settled into a tense yet oddly companionable rhythm, Aurelia sorting and labeling folders while Sebastian typed away at his laptop, occasionally pausing to answer her clarifying questions. As the minutes slipped by, she found herself growing more at ease. Despite his reputation, Sebastian remained polite, never raising his voice or criticizing her method. Indeed, it was one of the calmest stretches of time she'd ever spent in his presence. Eventually, curiosity prodded at her. She wondered why he'd entrusted her with tasks so clearly tied to his private finances. Did this signal a measure of trust, or was it simply expedience born from understaffing? Before she could puzzle it out, the door swung open without warning. Donovan Pierce, unannounced, strolled into the study. His gaze flicked between the two of them, and a sharp, knowing grin curved across his lips. My, Donovan drawled. "Aurelia, you're everywhere these days. Handled the kitchen chores, the housekeeping, and now Sebastian's personal files. Busy bee, aren't you?" His tone carried a heavy dose of innuendo, as if implying something more than mere workplace duties. Sebastian's eyes narrowed. "Donovan," he said in a tone that suggested the man's timing was far from welcome, "I'm in the middle of something. If you need to speak with me, you can wait or come back later." Donovan ignored him, leaning casually against the wall, arms folded. "I've been meaning to let you know I'm hosting a small gathering in the city next weekend, and your presence is requested. Perhaps Aurelia could join as well if she's versatile in her skill set." Heat flooded Aurelia's cheeks. The disrespect in Donovan's words was impossible to miss. She kept her gaze on the folder in her hands, determined not to dignify his provocation with a reaction. Sebastian, however, rose to his feet, bristling. "She works for me, not you. Let's not complicate that." His voice held a warning undertone. Donovan only smirked, amusement dancing in his eyes. Touchy, are we? He pushed off the wall, stepping closer to Sebastian. Calm down, old friend. I'm simply suggesting she might enjoy a break from the daily grind. Perhaps she'd be grateful for new opportunities. The last word hung in the air like a challenge. Aurelia stiffened, unsure whether Sebastian would take the bait. Tension crackled between the men, and in that electric moment, she wondered if Donovan was deliberately prodding Sebastian's vulnerabilities, whatever complicated history they shared. The air felt charged enough to spark at any second. Finally, Sebastian spoke, his voice low but deadly calm. Donovan, you can show yourself out. I'll consider your invitation in my own time. He flicked his gaze at Aurelia. We're busy here. With a mocking bow, Donovan retreated, though not without casting Aurelia a sly glance that made her stomach churn. Once he was gone, the study fell silent. Aurelia clutched the folder, fighting the urge to apologize or flee. Sebastian looked at her, his jaw set, and exhaled as though he'd been holding his breath. Don't pay attention to him, he muttered, returning to his desk. He likes to provoke people. Aurelia nodded, relief battling with residual nerves. I understand, she whispered, resuming her task. Yet even as she continued alphabetizing documents, her mind struggled to shake off Donovan's insinuations. She recalled his mocking smiles, the subtle jabs at her position. It struck her that despite Sebastian's stern manner, he had attempted, in his own way, to shield her from Donovan's brashness. And so they worked on, the quiet only broken by the soft shuffling of papers. Aurelia couldn't stop wondering about the undercurrents swirling through the estate. Donovan's presence was a toxin, exposing cracks in Sebastian's composure, and perhaps in his motivations as well. She suspected that Donovan's taunts might not be mere jests, but well-aimed attempts to unravel something Sebastian guarded fiercely. Yet for the moment, there was no time to contemplate it further. She refocused on her labels and folders, ignoring the unsettled feeling that something bigger was brewing beneath the surface, something that might soon pull them all into a confrontation they couldn't avoid. Over the following days, the estate buzzed with subtle tensions. Donovan remained a guest, albeit an unwelcome one in Aurelia's eyes. She noticed how the staff tiptoed around him, eager to avoid his sharp tongue. Mrs. Hopkins confided that he and Sebastian had once been close friends, forging a bond through business ventures in their youth. No one seemed entirely certain what caused the rift that now appeared to be widening with every smug remark Donovan hurled. Amid that undercurrent, Aurelia's routine continued. She juggled household responsibilities with unwavering diligence, determined to prove her worth. More than once, she crossed paths with Donovan in the hallways. Each time, he'd offer a snide comment, and she'd respond with a polite nod, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a flustered reaction. She told herself it was best to remain steady, especially given that Sebastian, in his own unspoken way, had advised her to ignore the provocations. Yet something else changed too. Sebastian himself seemed more vigilant. On a couple of occasions, Aurelia caught him observing her from across a room, his gaze riddled with conflicted intensity. She couldn't interpret his silent looks, and he never offered an explanation. Still, it felt different from before, as though he struggled to reconcile his role as her employer with the swirl of empathy or protectiveness Donovan's barbs had triggered. Late one afternoon, Aurelia slipped into the kitchen, intending to brew tea. She found Sebastian there unexpectedly, rummaging through a cabinet as though searching for something. He glanced over, his expression softening slightly. Aurelia, he said almost as a greeting rather than an order. Do you know if we have any chamomile left? She nodded, retrieving a small tin from the pantry. Here, Mr. Cross, she said, handing it over. He accepted it with a quiet thanks, then lingered, as though hesitating on the brink of conversation. Aurelia filled the kettle, uncertain how to navigate this moment of domestic normalcy with a man who usually kept every conversation strictly about tasks. How is your brother? He asked at last, surprising her. When she looked up, she saw genuine interest in his eyes, tentative but real. Her heart fluttered. She hadn't expected him to remember, let alone inquire. He's better, she replied. He's had some tests done and the doctors think it's nothing too serious. We're awaiting final results, but he's feeling hopeful. She paused. Thank you for asking. Sebastian nodded, placing the tin of chamomile on the counter. He seemed to wrestle with his next words. I'm glad to hear it. If there's anything else you need, he trailed off, as though uneasy completing the offer. She smiled, a small, sincere curve of her lips. I appreciate that. Really, I do. The warmth of gratitude swept through her, momentarily overwhelming her usual caution. This was the same man who once chastised her over the tiniest table-setting error. And here he was, awkwardly yet earnestly displaying concern. Before the moment could deepen, Donovan's voice echoed from the hallway, growing louder as he approached. Instantly, Sebastian's posture stiffened. He picked up the chamomile tin and cleared his throat, resuming his usual stony facade. By the time Donovan sauntered into the kitchen, the atmosphere of quiet openness had vanished like steam from a kettle. Donovan eyed them both, an unctuous grin curving his lips. Am I interrupting something cozy? He teased, voice loaded with insinuation. Aurelia busied herself wiping the counter, ignoring him. Sebastian said nothing, turning away to measure tea leaves into a strainer. Undeterred, Donovan strolled closer, leaning against the counter. You know, Sebastian, I'm throwing that gathering downtown tomorrow. Wouldn't it be splendid if Aurelia joined? He spoke Aurelia's name as though it were a garnish on a dish he found amusing. Sebastian shot him a warning glare. We've been over this. His tone was clipped, near the breaking point. Undaunted, Donovan smirked. Just trying to expand horizons. But if you insist on keeping her to yourself. He let the sentence hang provocatively. Aurelia felt her cheeks burn at his insinuation, fury and embarrassment tangling in her gut. Tension stretched in the small kitchen, an invisible cord threatening to snap. Sensing a meltdown on the horizon, Aurelia decided to extricate herself. I'll leave you both to your business, she said softly, stepping around Donovan. Sebastian offered the faintest tilt of his head in agreement. Whether granting her permission or silently apologizing, she couldn't say. She slipped out into the hallway, her heart hammering. She could still hear Donovan chuckling, lobbing some jest in Sebastian's direction. Whatever quiet understanding she'd shared with Sebastian moments before had shattered in the face of Donovan's manipulations. And once again, Aurelia found herself yearning for the day Donovan would finally leave, taking his poisoned tongue with him. Until then, every step in the cross estate felt like treading a minefield, where each misstep threatened to upend the fragile ties Aurelia had begun to forge with the man who held her fate in his carefully guarded hands. The next night arrived, and Donovan's much-vaunted gathering took place downtown. To Aurelia's relief, Sebastian departed for the event alone, leaving her to manage the estate in his absence. She busied herself overseeing dinner for the remaining staff, tidying the parlors, and ensuring every corridor was secure. When the last chore was complete, she retreated to her room, grateful for a moment of peace. But sleep proved elusive. Her mind flicked to the memory of Donovan's taunts, the resigned tension in Sebastian's jaw when confronted with the man's barbs. She couldn't shake the sensation that she was an unwilling pawn in a twisted game between old associates. Pushing aside the blankets, she grabbed her phone to check on Caleb, hoping the sound of his voice might bring calm. Hey, sis, Caleb answered, sounding more alert than he had in days. I was just about to text you. The final test results came in. No major issues, just stress migraines. Relief surged in Aurelia, making her eyes sting with tears. She swiftly blinked away. That's wonderful news, she said softly, pressing a hand to her chest. No more big scares then? He confirmed, adding that the doctor had recommended lifestyle changes and some medication if needed. They chatted for a few minutes longer, exchanging small details about their days. Aurelia felt a fresh wave of gratitude for Sebastian's advance, which had allowed these tests to happen swiftly. After assuring Caleb she'd visit soon, she hung up, feeling a measure of hope that the storm clouds in her life were beginning to lift, at least concerning her brother's health. She had just set down the phone when she heard a commotion in the corridor, quiet, urgent voices, and the hurried tapping of footsteps. Curious, she stepped outside and saw Beatrice, the younger maid, rushing toward her. Aurelia, it's Mr. Cross is back, she whispered, eyes wide. And he's not in a good mood. Aurelia's stomach twisted with concern. What happened? Beatrice shook her head, whispering frantically. I'm not sure. He and Donovan returned together. Both of them seemed angry. They nearly knocked over a vase in the foyer. Donovan was shouting something about loyalty and cover-ups. Mrs. Hopkins is trying to calm them down. Alarm jolted through Aurelia. She thanked Beatrice and hurried toward the grand foyer, half expecting to find shattered glass and toppled furniture. Instead, she saw Donovan standing near the base of the staircase, his suit jacket askew, face flushed from either alcohol or rage, perhaps both. Sebastian stood several paces away, posture stiff with indignation, his eyes blazing. Mrs. Hopkins hovered at a slight distance, hands clasped in anxious worry. A footman lingered uncertainly in the background, as though unsure whether to step in. Aurelia's heart clenched at the sight of Donovan pointing an accusatory finger at Sebastian, voice slurring. "You always thought you were better than me, ever since the first deal we struck. What was it, back when we were just a couple of scrappy entrepreneurs?" He barked a mirthless laugh, turning his contempt on Aurelia, who had approached with caution. "And now you want to play the protector for your precious maid, acting like some saint?" Sebastian's jaw clenched, the veins in his neck prominent. "You're drunk," he said in an icy tone. "This conversation can wait until morning, if there's anything left to say." Donovan spat on the marble floor, an act so shockingly disrespectful that Aurelia gasped. "You're just upset I see through you," he sneered, "hiding behind your checkbook, using people like disposable pawns, then getting riled up when someone else calls you on it." His gaze flicked to Aurelia, and a nasty grin spread across his lips. "That's all she is, right? Another piece in your game. Why else would you keep her so close?" Aurelia's cheeks flamed. She opened her mouth to protest, but words failed her. She was about to step forward when Sebastian abruptly closed the gap, his voice vibrating with barely contained fury. "Donovan, you've gone too far. Get out, now." For a moment, it seemed Donovan might lunge at Sebastian. Mrs. Hopkins let out a startled gasp, but Donovan only chuckled coldly. "Have it your way," he slurred, "but don't pretend you're any better. I'll leave, and I'll be sure to let everyone know what kind of man Sebastian Cross really is, one who can't even defend his staff without exposing his own weaknesses." Without another word, Donovan staggered toward the front door. A footman quickly opened it, ushering him outside. The door slammed shut, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. Aurelia stood rooted to the spot, heart pounding. Sebastian took a long breath, turning away from them all. In that moment, he looked more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. A man betrayed by a friend, humiliated in his own home. Mrs. Hopkins murmured softly, "Is everything all right, Mr. Cross?" But Sebastian didn't respond. He only shook his head and ascended the staircase, each step echoing with a sense of finality. Aurelia watched him disappear into the next floor, torn between concern and a strange flutter of empathy. Donovan was gone, likely for good. Yet the damage he'd inflicted lingered like a toxic cloud, leaving them all to wonder how the aftermath might reshape the fragile bonds within the Cross estate. The household staff awoke the next morning to an unfamiliar hush. It was as though the entire mansion held its breath, absorbing the fallout from Donovan's departure. Aurelia rose early, half expecting Sebastian to issue a series of draconian orders or perhaps vanish into his study. Instead, the day began with a subdued normalcy, breakfast prepared on schedule, the footman polishing silverware, and Mrs. Hopkins overseeing the rest of the morning routine. Aurelia handled her tasks quietly, her mind whirling with questions. She replayed Donovan's vicious accusations, particularly the insinuation that Sebastian was merely using her, though for what purpose Donovan never explicitly stated. The memory made her stomach turn. She wanted to believe Sebastian had shown genuine concern, not manipulation. But Donovan's words lingered in her mind, sowing seeds of doubt. Shortly after lunch, Aurelia was in the parlor, straightening cushions and dusting the piano, when Mrs. Hopkins entered, looking uncertain. "He's asked for you," the older woman said gently. "Mr. Cross, he's in his study." Aurelia set aside her feather duster, a quiet dread threading through her. Why would Sebastian summon her now? Was he about to discharge her, fearing the rumors Donovan might spread? Yet she sensed a different possibility, that he might finally address the tension which had brewed around them for weeks. Walking the corridor to Sebastian's study felt like traversing a mile-long tunnel. She knocked softly. "Enter," came his voice. She pushed open the door to find him standing by the window, looking out at the estate's manicured gardens. He turned at her arrival, his expression unreadable. Close the door, he instructed, his tone civil but firm. She did so, then stood near the entrance, waiting. Sebastian crossed the room in a few strides, stopping a couple of feet from her. I trust you saw some of Donovan's behavior last night, he began, folding his arms. He's no longer welcome here. Aurelia nodded, unsure how to respond. She forced herself to meet his gaze, though it took courage to do so. I did, sir. He seemed very angry, said some awful things. Sebastian's jaw tightened. He's always had a knack for digging up personal pain and turning it into a spectacle. He hesitated, as if debating how much to reveal. We used to be partners, friends even. Over time, greed and jealousy corrupted our relationship, culminating in business betrayals I won't detail. His words last night were the final nail in the coffin. She regarded him quietly, noting the weariness etched into the lines around his eyes. Donovan's departure clearly weighed on him more than he let on. I'm sorry, she offered, her voice gentle. No one deserves a friend who twists the knife like that. He nodded, his gaze drifting to the floor. Thank you. Silence stretched, and Aurelia sensed there was more on his mind. At last he looked up. I know he made insinuations. About me, about you. You should know that I never intended. He paused, exhaling. I'm aware of my reputation here, Aurelia, and I can be critical, demanding. But I do respect you, and I value your work. None of what Donovan said has any basis in truth. Emotion fluttered in her chest, a mix of relief and a guarded yearning for clarity. I appreciate you saying that, she managed. Donovan's words were cruel, and I didn't believe them. Not really, but for a moment I worried there might be some motive I wasn't seeing. His dark eyes flickered with something akin to regret. I won't pretend I haven't struggled with trust. I built walls for a reason. Yet in the past months you've shown me that not everyone is out to betray me. He paused, clearing his throat. I'm not explaining this well. Aurelia's heart pounded, her breath catching at the vulnerability in his voice. She dared to take a half-step closer. You're explaining enough, she said softly. Sometimes a few words are all it takes. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of Sebastian's lips. Then let me add this. If Donovan or anyone else ever suggests you're merely a pawn to me, know that it's a lie. I see you as a person who's persevered through things I can only imagine. And I respect that more than I've let on. Heat rushed to Aurelia's cheeks. She bowed her head, hiding her reaction. Thank you, Mr. Cross, she whispered. Despite the flurry of emotions, she couldn't quite bring herself to address him less formally. He seemed to accept that, stepping back and releasing a silent breath. You can go. I won't keep you from your duties. His tone returned to a more professional register, yet his eyes shone with an unspoken warmth. She turned to leave, her pulse racing. At the door, she paused, glancing over her shoulder. I'm here if you need anything, she offered, surprising even herself with the quiet note of compassion in her voice. He dipped his head in acknowledgement, and she left, softly closing the door behind her, heart thrumming. Aurelia moved down the corridor in a daze. Donovan's departure, though chaotic, had stripped away some of the tension clouding the estate. In the aftermath, she and Sebastian had glimpsed a fragile new understanding. It wasn't quite friendship, not yet, but it was a step away from the cold formality that had once defined their every interaction. And for Aurelia, that was enough to plant the seeds of hope in a place she never thought she'd find it. A few days passed in relative calm, allowing the staff to settle back into a rhythm untainted by Donovan's disruptive presence. It was in that lull that Sebastian announced an upcoming dinner party, this time a formal gathering of potential investors and partners. Unlike Donovan's private soiree, this event demanded the full showcase of the Cross Estate's hospitality. A hush of anticipation spread among the household as invitations were confirmed and final details solidified. Aurelia was tasked with coordinating the floral arrangements and polishing the estate's silver, ensuring each piece shone like newly minted currency. She embraced the challenge, using it as a chance to demonstrate her meticulousness, hoping to alleviate any stress Sebastian might feel. The day of the dinner party arrived swathed in a flurry of activity, chefs in the kitchen conjuring gourmet dishes, footmen double-checking seating charts, and Mrs. Hopkins leading a small army of maids to prepare the guest rooms for any out-of-town visitors. Sebastian, for his part, appeared more composed than Aurelia might have expected. He circulated through the main hall, speaking with staff in low, measured tones. There were no panicked instructions or barked reprimands, just a calm supervision that spoke to a confidence in his team, perhaps even in Aurelia specifically. Now and then, she felt the weight of his gaze on her as she arranged blossoms in tall crystal vases or carefully placed name cards along the dining table. Each time, she looked up to see him watching, an unreadable expression on his face, before he turned away to confer with someone else. As evening descended, the estate filled with the soft murmur of arriving guests. In elegant attire, men and women stepped through the grand entrance, exchanging polite greetings and admiring the meticulously restored frescoes on the ceiling. Aurelia remained in the background, ensuring the final touches were perfect, adjusting a stray napkin, lighting the last candle, directing the footmen to discreetly replenish the buffet. She felt a stirring of pride in her work, an echo of the sense of accomplishment that had once drawn her to housekeeping as a temporary job. When Sebastian finally made his entrance in the reception hall, he was the embodiment of poised authority. Clad in a tailored suit of midnight blue, he commanded attention without seeming ostentatious. Guests gathered, praising the estate's beauty and the efficiency of his staff. Aurelia caught fragments of conversation lauding the polished silverware, the impeccable place settings, and the graceful floral arrangements. She glanced at Sebastian, noticing how he briefly inclined his head when people complimented the decor. Never directly crediting her, but not overshadowing her contributions either. Midway through the event, Aurelia found herself in the dining room, discreetly removing empty plates and wine glasses. She overheard bits of the guests' chatter about market expansions, investment portfolios, and corporate takeovers, topics she had little first-hand knowledge of. The polite laughter and clink of crystal provided a mellow soundtrack, one that allowed Aurelia to slip in and out without disruption. Suddenly, as she collected a set of dessert dishes, she heard someone call her name. Startled, she turned to see Nathaniel Blackwood, one of Sebastian's important investors, smiling at her. "My dear, might I trouble you for another glass of that excellent Bordeaux?" he asked, raising an empty goblet. "Certainly, sir," Aurelia responded, dipping her head. She took the glass and placed it on her tray, stepping away to fetch a refill. When she returned, Mr. Blackwood thanked her, adding in a low murmur, "I must say the staff here is extraordinary. Your attention to detail is commendable. Mr. Cross is lucky to have you." Aurelia felt a warm flush and managed a modest nod. "Thank you. We strive to maintain high standards." She could sense Sebastian's gaze from across the table, though she dared not glance over to confirm. For a moment, she wondered if he'd heard Blackwood's compliment. If so, how would he respond? As the meal progressed, the guests seemed genuinely impressed by every element of the evening. Conversations flowed, deals were hinted at, and the air crackled with the potential of lucrative alliances. Aurelia remained vigilant until the last plate was cleared, ensuring no glass sat empty and no detail was overlooked. By the time dinner wound down and people gravitated toward the parlor for coffee and brandy, her feet ached from countless steps across the estate's marble floors. But satisfaction thrummed in her veins. When the final guest departed, the clock struck close to midnight. Aurelia and a few staffers began the cleanup, stacking dishes for the kitchen to wash and returning stray chairs to their rightful places. She was arranging leftover flowers into smaller vases for the staff's rooms when she sensed a presence behind her. Turning, she saw Sebastian, his tie loosened, fatigue evident in his posture. "You've worked tirelessly tonight," he observed quietly. Everything went smoothly. The guests were pleased. She set a vase down, meeting his eyes. "I'm glad. Everyone pulled together to make it happen." In the hush of the now empty dining room, she felt the day's tension slip into a calmer resonance between them. He studied her for a long moment, as though weighing words he rarely spoke. "I appreciate your effort, truly. You've made a difference here." There was a softness in his expression, a glimpse of the man beneath the wealthy exterior. A gentle warmth spread through Aurelia's chest. This was praise, openly given. She nodded, acknowledging his gratitude. "It means a lot, Mr. Cross," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the flutter inside. Thank you. He nodded, turning to leave, then paused. Glancing back, he added, and call me Sebastian, at least when we're not surrounded by a room full of investors. With that, he disappeared into the corridor, leaving Aurelia to wonder if this was yet another door quietly opening in their once strictly professional relationship. The aftermath of the successful dinner party ushered in a welcome sense of tranquility throughout the Cross estate. Sebastian, though still maintaining his usual reserved demeanor, became more approachable, at least by his standards. He stopped by the kitchen once or twice to briefly confer with Aurelia about meal schedules or to solicit her thoughts on smaller household details. Their exchanges were efficient yet tinged with a new layer of mutual respect, a subtle shift she found both gratifying and nerve-wracking. Days turned into a week. As Aurelia continued her duties, managing the cleanliness of the sprawling mansion, dealing with suppliers, tending to the intricacies of staff schedules, she occasionally caught sight of Sebastian in a thoughtful mood, as though something weighed on his mind. He'd pace the hallways or linger in a room longer than usual, always seeming on the verge of saying more. But just as quickly, he'd retreat behind his wall of composure. Aurelia wasn't sure if she should be relieved or disappointed. One afternoon, a light rain pattered against the estate's massive windows, washing the manicured gardens in a glossy sheen. Aurelia was in the library, dusting tall shelves filled with thick tomes and leather-bound volumes. The hush of the room soothed her. She found an odd comfort in the smell of old paper and wood polish. She paused to read the spines of a few books, marveling at the range of topics: economics, philosophy, art history, even some rare first editions. She wondered how many Sebastian had read and whether he'd selected them himself. She nearly jumped when Sebastian himself appeared in the library doorway, apparently not expecting to see her there. "Aurelia," he said, halting. His voice remained calm, yet she sensed the faint surprise in his tone. "I didn't realize anyone was in here." "I'm just finishing up," she replied, trying to steady her nerves. "This room needed a thorough dusting." She gestured to the tall ladder that allowed her to reach the top shelves. "Should I leave you to your reading, Mr. Cross? I mean Sebastian?" He regarded her for a moment, then shook his head. "No need. I just came to find a volume on European market trends." He approached one of the lower shelves, scanning titles. Aurelia hovered a few steps away, uncertain whether to slip out quietly or continue her housekeeping. As he searched, the soft tap of rain on glass filled the silence, creating an oddly intimate atmosphere. At last, he plucked a thick book from a shelf, flipping through its pages. "I'm preparing for a new expansion overseas," he explained without prompting, as though making casual conversation. "We're looking at potential offices in Germany and France." "That sounds ambitious," Aurelia offered. She considered whether to say more, then decided to venture a polite question. "Are you excited?" He let out a low, introspective hum. "I suppose so, but with every expansion comes risk. I try to weigh the pros and cons before committing." She nodded, emboldened by the minimal tension in the air. "Calculated risks often pay off, though. From what I've seen, you're someone who's not afraid to push boundaries, within reason." His gaze rose from the book to her face, a flicker of intrigue passing across his features. "You notice more than you let on," he said softly, shutting the volume. "Sometimes I forget that the staff sees a great deal of my business dealings, albeit from the periphery." Aurelia gave a faint smile, placing the rag in her apron pocket. "You might be surprised at how much we observe, but I only speak up if asked." The corners of his mouth quirked upward in a fleeting expression akin to amusement. "Noted." He stepped closer to return the book, standing perhaps an arm's length away. Her pulse quickened at his proximity. "Aurelia, His voice trailed off, as if he'd lost the words he intended to say. She felt a charge in the air, recalling times he'd seemed on the brink of confiding in her or thanking her in a more personal way. Yet a flicker of doubt clouded his eyes, and she sensed he might withdraw again. Before either could break the silence, Mrs. Hopkins appeared in the doorway. "Pardon me," she said, clearing her throat, "but you are wanted on the phone, Mr. Cross. It's the Berlin office." Sebastian blinked, stepping back. "Right," he said, regathering his composure. With a nod to Aurelia, he tucked the book under his arm and moved toward the door. "We'll talk another time," he murmured, an unspoken promise lingering in his tone. Aurelia watched him leave, her heart fluttering in ways she refused to fully acknowledge. She silently cursed the interruption, but also recognized it was a reminder of Sebastian's ceaseless responsibilities. Returning to her dusting, she found her mind drifting over the conversation's near confession. A swirl of anticipation mingled with caution. She had to be careful, mindful of the precarious boundary between employee and employer, especially one as complicated as Sebastian Cross. The brisk pace of daily life at the Cross estate continued, but an undercurrent of anticipation threaded through Aurelia's every task. She sensed the same tension in Sebastian, glimpsing it in how he sometimes hovered near her workspace or paused in conversation as though weighing every word. Meanwhile, the rest of the staff carried on as usual, mostly oblivious to the subtle shifts unfolding behind the scenes. Late one evening, Aurelia finished tidying the main living room. The overhead lights were dimmed, casting a mellow glow across the furniture. It had been a long day, and she rubbed at a kink in her neck, longing for her modest bed in the staff quarters. Just as she was about to leave, she heard footsteps approaching. Turning, she saw Sebastian entering the room, jacket draped over one arm, tie loosened as though he'd just wrapped up a lengthy meeting. She straightened. "Mr. Cross, Sebastian," she corrected softly. "Is there anything else you need?" He shook his head. "No, everything seems in order." He set his jacket on the back of a nearby armchair, rolling the tension from his shoulders. There was a moment of thick silence. Finally, he gestured to the sofa, half a smile curving his lips. "Might we sit for a minute, if you're not too busy?" Aurelia hesitated, her gaze flicking to the stately clock on the mantel. It was well past normal working hours, but she found no immediate excuse to refuse. Something in Sebastian's demeanor suggested he had more to say than the usual instructions. "Of course," she answered, choosing a spot at the far end of the sofa. He sat a polite distance away, posture upright, though less rigid than usual. For a few beats, they said nothing. The hush of the estate at night enveloped them, broken only by the faint hum of air conditioning and the occasional creak of old floorboards. Aurelia felt her nerves mounting, half wishing he'd speak. At last, Sebastian cleared his throat. "I wanted to thank you again," he said. "Not just for your duties, but for how you've handled everything, especially during Donovan's disastrous visits. I realize his insinuations were uncomfortable." She released a shaky breath. "It wasn't easy, but I managed," she admitted. "Still, your intervention helped. He was crossing lines that no guest should cross." Sebastian nodded, a flicker of regret darkening his eyes. "I should have done more, earlier. Letting him stay as long as he did was a mistake. I'd hoped we could salvage our partnership, but Donovan thrives on conflict." He paused, his voice dropping to a murmur. "And I regret how that conflict spilled over onto you." Aurelia mustered a thin smile. "Thank you for saying that, really." She glanced at the low table, feeling her chest tighten with unspoken questions. He'd expressed remorse, but where did that leave them now? As if sensing her thoughts, Sebastian continued, "I'm not good at opening up, at talking about the things that matter. My past experiences have left me wary." He exhaled, looking more vulnerable than she'd ever seen. "Donovan's betrayal and my former fiancée walking away. It reinforced the idea that trust is a liability." Aurelia's heart ached at the rawness in his voice. She remembered hearing rumors of heartbreak and betrayal, but had never gotten the details. "I understand," she said quietly, meeting his gaze. "Trust is scary when you have been hurt, but it can be worth it." He studied her as though unraveling a puzzle. "You speak from your own experiences, I suspect." She swallowed, recalling her own struggles, taking guardianship of Caleb, bouncing between part-time jobs, living in constant anxiety over finances. "Yes, life has taught me to stand on my own, but I've also learned that leaning on the right person can be a relief, not a weakness." A ghost of a smile flickered on his lips. "Wise words," he said, shifting to face her more directly. "Do you consider me someone you can lean on, then?" The question, quiet and laced with vulnerability, caught her off guard. She blinked, her heart pounding. Part of her wanted to answer immediately. "Yes, perhaps I do," but caution tempered her response. "I think we're both still figuring that out," she said at last, a wry quirk to her mouth. A low chuckle escaped him. a genuine sound that softened his features. Fair enough, he agreed, resting one hand on the sofa's arm. But I'd like to be that person, Aurelia, if you'll let me. His words hung in the air, an unspoken admission bridging the gap between them. Aurelia's pulse raced, torn between the pragmatic voice warning her to keep professional boundaries and the gentler whisper urging her to let down her guard, if only a little. I, she started, voice trembling. But the moment was shattered by the ring of Sebastian's phone, shrill and insistent in the hush. They both startled. He grimaced apologetically, pulling the device from his pocket. I'm sorry, it's a European call I've been expecting. Rising from the sofa, he stepped aside to answer, voice low. Aurelia exhaled, the abrupt end to their conversation leaving her both relieved and disappointed. She stood, smoothing her skirt, uncertain if she should stay or go. In the end, she gave him a polite nod he might not have even seen, then slipped out of the room. With each step back to her quarters, her mind churned over the fragile, intimate moment they'd shared. She had glimpsed the man behind the formidable exterior, a wounded soul seeking connection. But forging that connection carried risks she wasn't sure she could afford. By the time she entered her modest room, she felt both hopeful and anxious, her thoughts a jumble of what-ifs. Leaning against the closed door, she pressed a palm to her racing heart. Maybe Donovan was right about one thing. Sebastian Cross cared more than he admitted. For Aurelia, the question became whether she could let herself care in return without shattering the tenuous foundation of her carefully built life. In the days that followed, Aurelia found herself living in an odd state of heightened awareness. Every passing conversation with Sebastian felt loaded with unspoken possibilities. Each shared glance electric with the memory of that near confession on the sofa. She continued her tasks diligently, organizing staff schedules, fine-tuning meal plans, and ensuring the estate remained immaculate. Yet her mind often flickered back to the moment when Sebastian quietly admitted his desire to be someone she could rely on. Then, one afternoon, the tenuous calm fractured. Aurelia received a call from an unknown number. Caleb's voice trembled on the line. Sis, I had a rough day. My headaches are returning, and the doctor wants more tests. I'm short on rent this month, too. I hate asking. He trailed off, clearly distressed. Aurelia's heart squeezed. She assured him she'd figure something out, even though she'd barely recovered from the previous expenses. She spent the next few hours racking her brain, scanning her meager savings. The small cushion she'd managed to build was nearly depleted. Anxious and flustered, she faltered in her chores. When she accidentally dropped a fragile vase, luckily catching it before it shattered, her nerves nearly unraveled. She retreated to a side corridor, pressing her back to the wall, eyes burning with unshed tears. Caleb needed her, and she felt stretched too thin to help. To her surprise, Sebastian appeared at the end of the corridor, halting when he noticed her trembling. Concern flared in his dark eyes. Aurelia, he said gently, stepping closer. What's wrong? His question carried empathy rather than reprimand. She tried to steady her voice but failed. It's my brother, she admitted, swallowing hard. He has more medical bills, and I don't know how to cover them. I've stretched everything to the limit. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. I'm sorry, I shouldn't bother you with this. He shook his head, brows drawn. Don't say that. Without hesitation, he placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that felt both comforting and startlingly intimate. Let me help. Her eyes widened in alarm. I can't ask for another advance, Sebastian. You've already... I'm not talking about an advance, he interjected, voice gentle but firm. I'm offering real help. Consider it a personal favor, or... He paused, expression taut with sincerity. Consider it someone who cares. The emotion in his voice tore down her last defenses. She felt tears threatening to spill again, torn between gratitude and fear of owing him too much. I can't just take your money, she whispered. I don't want to be indebted to you beyond a salary. Sebastian exhaled, seeming to understand the conflict raging inside her. Aurelia, you are more to me than an employee. This house, it feels different with you in it. Warmer somehow. If I have the means to help, why shouldn't I? He sighed, glancing aside as if bracing for rejection. Please don't see this as a transaction. I only wish to lighten your burden. A flash of memory returned the night he admitted his difficulty with trust. Now he stood before her, extending more than just financial support. He was extending himself. Aurelia wavered, tears welling. I'm scared, she admitted, voice shaking. Scared that accepting more from you will cross lines I've held for so long. Lines meant to keep me safe. He stepped closer, gaze unwavering. I understand, but maybe some lines are meant to be redrawn. Slowly he reached for her hand. She let him take it, her heart pounding at the warmth of his touch. You don't have to answer now, he murmured. Just know I'm here, in whatever capacity you'll have me. Time seemed to freeze in that quiet corridor. Aurelia felt every breath, every heartbeat. Finally she nodded, tears slipping free in earnest. I do need help. Caleb can't wait. Her voice wobbled with relief and the tangle of emotions swirling inside her. I'll pay you back. In time. Or, he hushed her gently. We'll figure it out together. Then in a tentative, unguarded move, he drew her into a brief, delicate embrace. She froze for an instant before allowing herself to lean into the warmth of his chest. The tears came freely now, each one shedding the weight of her uncertainty. In that moment, she sensed the shift from employer-employee to something more profound, a bond formed by compassion and honest vulnerability. When they finally pulled apart, Aurelia managed a watery smile. Thank you, she breathed, her cheeks flushed. He nodded, his own expression tinged with awe and relief. Over the following days, Sebastian assisted with Caleb's medical expenses, discreetly yet without hesitation. Aurelia took slow, cautious steps toward trusting the sincerity of his help. In turn, Sebastian allowed himself to feel for someone outside the narrow confines he'd built, letting her presence in his life soften his edges. Weeks later, the estate thrummed with a quieter rhythm, one shaped by the steady interplay of their shared warmth. They worked side by side, navigating the responsibilities that once felt heavy, but now seemed lighter with mutual understanding. And one evening, as Aurelia finished organizing fresh flowers in the foyer, Sebastian approached, a gentle smile playing on his lips. Can we talk? He asked, voice brimming with a quiet earnestness. She set aside the flowers, turning to him with her heart racing. Of course, she said, stepping closer. The echoes of the estate's past tensions felt distant, replaced by a sense of belonging she'd never anticipated when she first walked through those imposing doors. With no further words needed, he offered his hand. She accepted it, and together they walked into the dimly lit sitting room, two souls finding solace in the companionship they had once believed impossible. In that shared silence, they acknowledged a truth that neither had to speak aloud. That trust, however fragile, had guided them from a place of guarded indifference to a bond of genuine connection. And for Aurelia, the cold millionaire who had once been merely her demanding employer had become the man she cared for, a partner in life's uncertainties, and an unexpected source of hope she never saw coming. Looking back on this story, I can't help but feel inspired by how even the hardest hearts can be softened when empathy and kindness bridge the divide. The unlikely bond between a disciplined millionaire and a quietly determined maid reminds us that beneath our facades, we all yearn for understanding and connection. Watching them navigate misunderstandings, confront lingering pain, and gradually uncover each other's vulnerabilities was both emotional and uplifting. Ultimately, this story left me hopeful. Hopeful that second chances exist when we dare to see beyond labels and trust the person standing before us. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did any moment resonate with you or change the way you view these characters? Share your perspectives in the comments and let's continue the conversation together. After all, storytelling is most powerful when we reflect, discuss, and learn from each other.